It's Monster Mondays with me, Geoff Arbuckle. It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but if you've heard this show before, you know what I'm going to say. Mondays are for me to talk about monster movies. Another new monster movie is coming out this week, a new version of Hellboy, so there's no better time to revisit Guillermo del Toro's version of the BPRD's Key Agent from 2004. But what is the BPRD and who is Hellboy? Well, to answer those questions, let's go back to the realm of comic books. Hellboy was created in 1993 by comic book artist Mike Mignola. Mignola had worked professionally as an artist since the beginning of the 80s or so, but it wouldn't take long for him to explode onto the scene. By the mid-80s, he was inking titles at Marvel like Daredevil, The Incredible Hulk, and working on limited series featuring everyone's favorite furry Guardian of the Galaxy, Rocket Raccoon. A few years later, he was working for DC as a penciler on the Phantom Stranger series and World of Krypton. Later, he'd have a huge impact on the Dark Knight himself, Batman, when Mignola was doing covers during the super famous A Death in the Family story. He'd also be the artist on the excellent Gotham by Gaslight story that placed Batman in the 19th century and is generally considered the first Elseworlds story that DC ever published. So, coming into 1993, Mignola had a lot of hits on his resume. He created Hellboy through some various creator-owned opportunities and would ultimately spin that into a series with Dark Horse Comics. Now, a prototype of the character appeared on the cover of an Italian magazine, and Hellboy's first appearance was in a short story in a black and white San Diego Comic-Con published book, which really kind of predated what most people would consider as his first mainstream appearance in John Byrne's Next Men number 21. But the character was an immediate success and had his own series by 1994 through Dark Horse Comics. Hellboy's universe would rapidly expand. He works for the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense, so the BPRD. Many of his co-workers are various other paranormal creatures or sensitives to various powers and abilities. Those others had colorful names like Abe Sapien, a humanoid fish creature who was a psychic as well, and Lobster Johnson, who was a vigilante who fought Nazis and paranormal threats back in the 30s, but worked with Hellboy and the BPRD as a ghost to help them on a mission in the present day. Then there was Liz Sherman, who was a young pyrokinetic. She accidentally killed her family when she was only 11 years old when her powers manifested. And being raised Catholic, she believed her uncontrolled powers were because of her sins. So as you can see, Mignola didn't really work with half-baked ideas. He had a handful of interesting characters to start and gave them a chance to bloom into well-developed, fully rounded characters. The movie begins in 1944 with a Nazi experiment in Scotland. The Allied forces are closing in on a group of Nazi occultists called the Thule Society. With the help of Rasputin, yes, that Rasputin, the Nazis plan to open an interdimensional portal to free some super nasty monsters imprisoned in space. The Allies win, but they discover a baby demon guy with a stone right fist. They name the cute little guy Hellboy, and the U.S. paranormal advisor, Trevor Brutenholm, who then later goes by the name of Broom, adopts and raises Hellboy as his son. In the 2000s, Broom runs the BPRD. Hellboy is all grown up, but he's getting harder and harder to hide from the world. Throughout the credits, we learn tabloids and various other outlets are reporting on his existence. However, he's kind of important in the fight against monsters and such. So, speaking of monsters, a couple of Nazis survived the attack in 1944. A cold-hearted bitch SS officer naturally named Ilsa, and a super cool steampunk-like robot guy named Cronin. They resurrect Rasputin and kind of help him continue to work on opening up that super scary portal during a lunar eclipse. A new agent, John Myers, comes to the BPRD to basically become the new handler for Hellboy because Broom has only a few weeks left to live thanks to an aggressive form of cancer. Together, along with Liz Sherman and Abe Sapien, they have to take down the remaining pieces of the occultist Thule Society and stop the beast they plan to unleash onto the world through Hellboy's natural demonic purpose for existence. But let's talk about those three things that I love about this movie. Like so many movies I talk about on this show, it's really tough to narrow it down to just three things, but I got to at least try. So let's start with director Guillermo del Toro himself. The man is one of the more imaginative directors out there. I like to think of him like the Steven Spielberg of horror and fantasy. In time, I'll talk many more of his movies on the show, but this is a great way to get introduced to him. While I freely admit that I haven't read nearly enough Hellboy in my life, despite being a huge comic book dork, I will say that when it was announced that Del Toro was going to direct the Hellboy movie, I was with everyone else, and we were all super excited on that. This was going to be a guy who gets it and will work nicely with the material that he's adapting. He perfectly mixes the horror and monster aspect with the more comedic and personality-filled elements of the Hellboy character himself. We'll get to more of that part momentarily, but let's talk a little bit about the personality of the movie itself. Del Toro knows that he's working with more extraordinary ideas. There are plenty wonderful little moments where the paranormal and the normal clash, and it leads to these funny moments where they both try to either handle what they are seeing and dealing with, or they are basically trying to fit in with their place in the world. The next thing that I want to talk about, the action pieces with the monsters, are really what you come to this movie for. You've got a big red demon guy, a blue fishy guy, a pyrokinetic girl, Rasputin, a steampunk robot man, a Nazi lady, and all sorts of tentacly monsters and various other goopy, drippy, and slimy monsters. You've got interdimensional overbeast and a reanimated corpse that's used as a tour guide to help the characters get to the final showdown. I mean, that all sounds like a real fun time to me. And while I have only mentioned them a couple of times, you have all these monsters, but you also have the greatest real-life monsters of them all, the Nazis. Their involvement almost gives the feel of an adventure movie like the Indiana Jones films. When you need a group of bad guys that practically need nothing at all extra to let you know that these guys are real bad dudes, you just call up the Nazis and they're all like, yeah, we can do that. And it's good for comics, for pulpy adventure movies, and it's just a great way to get me on board with your movie. Third, there's no way to talk about either of the Del Toro Hellboy movies without talking about Ron Perlman. For years, Perlman has been used in various ways as a character actor, both in and out of heavy makeup. Sometimes you can get really solid performances from him in smaller supporting roles, but as Hellboy, Perlman is just flat out amazing in the lead. He looks, sounds, and acts like what you would expect from that character. He's incredibly likable and a very kind of put upon type of lunchbox type of guy. What I mean is he's just doing this job that he almost finds mundane, but the rest of us would think it's incredible. He's sometimes grumpy, most of the time intimidating, but he's also very human in his reactions and how he cares for others. And speaking of how he cares for others, it's often stated and shown that that the Hellboy character has an affinity for cats. In one of the monster fighting scenes, he's even battling a gross beast one-handed while protecting a carton of kittens for a lady. As a cat lover myself, I can't say any of that harms my opinion of the big lug. So where I'm going with this is it absolutely helps inform how Perlman plays this part, not as a monster or a beast, but as a big old softie. The Hellboy movies are a little more of a mishmash of various Magnolia stories with the BPRD and Hellboy specifically, but they distill some of the best visual pieces from the source material and still puts it all together into a coherent and easy to follow story that is still pretty dense and doesn't sell out the original stories. Where some things are tweaked are probably more for wider audiences or studio requirements, like the romantic connection between Liz and Hellboy in these movies that doesn't exist in the comics, or at least didn't exist at the comics at that time. I'm sure some super fans were a little irritated, but for me and for the rest of the general audiences, I'm not upset at all. In fact, I highly recommend this really fun monster romp. You know what? I like talking about this movie and character so much, I think I should go see that new one at the end of this week and talk about that version for next week's episode. So next week's episode will be a little bit different. It's going to be a little bit more of a review of a current movie and less going back and talking about the history of the character or whatever. We're just going to review the movie for next week's episode. So look forward to that. With that said, let's wrap up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, see you later. And don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each and every Monday on filmseizure.com, as well as check out new posts at my website, bmovieinema.com, each Friday.